Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Inka Vat. Sri Lanka has voted in an outsider and a former insurgent as its new president in the first election since the country's 2022 economic collapse. It's the biggest electoral upset since Sri Lanka gained independence from Britain in 1948. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi was one of the first world leaders to congratulate Anura Kumara Dissanayake on his victory, saying Sri Lanka holds a special place in India's Neighbourhood First policy and Vision Sagar. I look forward to working closely with you to the benefit of our people and the entire region. The Chinese Foreign Ministry also conveyed its leaders' congratulations, saying Xi Jinping highly values the development of China-Sri Lanka relations and is ready to work with President Dissanayake to carry forward the traditional friendship, enhance political mutual trust and facilitate more fruitful, high-quality Belt and Road cooperation. Dissanayake, leader of left-leaning Janatha Vimukthi Peramuna, or JVP party, is not from either of Sri Lanka's powerful dynasties. Instead, he represents change and fresh hope. His victory, he said, was for the people of Sri Lanka. But can Dissanayake bring about the, quote, national liberation movement, not just a political party, that he promised supporters, even with depleted foreign exchange reserves and a stubbornly high cost of living? And will he be able to grow foreign investment while balancing ties with regional powers, India and China? Joining us today are Wen-Ti Sung, Atlantic Council China Hub non-resident fellow, and Ronan Fu, Academia Sinica Institute of Political Science Assistant Research Fellow. A very warm welcome to you both on the show today.
Thank you.
Known as the Pearl of the Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka lies 30 kilometres south of India amid the world's major shipping routes that connect east and west. In 2022, Sri Lanka declared bankruptcy after an economic collapse that saw inflation soar to 70%, medicine and fuel run out, and the people's overthrow of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. The country owes $36 billion in external debt, and today inflation stands at 0.5%. In the September 21 presidential election, among 38 candidates, Dissanayake received 42% of the vote. Coming in third on 17% was outgoing interim president Ranil Wickremesinghe, who has been PM 6 times. Wen-Ti, let me come to you first. It's been an extraordinary result. What does Dissanayake's victory mean in terms of where Sri Lankans want to go?
I think this just shows that there's a lot of desire for change at the moment. Obviously, there must be a lot of dissatisfaction with the status quo for a change of this scale to happen in Sri Lankan politics. We know that Sri Lanka in the last few years has been experiencing quite some economic challenges, including getting bailed from IMF, including struggling with loan repayments, domestic welfare spending cutbacks, and just general dissatisfaction in general. So I think what it tells us is that people feel that it cannot be politics as usual anymore in Sri Lanka, and that they're willing to place hope in a very different candidate this time around to see whether that change can also bring hope at the same time.
And were you surprised that he didn't get a majority, or does that indicate something about what people think about this massive change?
Well, I mean, Sri Lanka has a preferential voting system, so I think it's naturally that not everybody's going to be able to single-handedly get majority in the first round, especially for a transitional period like this, when Sri Lanka obviously going through just a people's power moment a couple of years ago, for example. So I think there's definitely diversity of opinion on the spectrum in Sri Lanka. But the fact that the new president is able to marshal a significant majority in the second round voting, I think still shows that the majority opinion is still on the side for change.
Ronan, Dissanayake says the root of Sri Lanka's economic problems are actually political. So he's promised cleaner, what he calls cleaner politics. How would you say that the politics is connected to the debt?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that assessment in the sense that part of the Sri Lanka's economic woes are deeply intertwined with its corruption and the intertwinedness, among political elites regarding how to run politics. So on the one hand, you see, poor management or poor governance, if you will. On the other hand, you see, funding through underperforming, infrastructure projects and so forth and so on. So I agree that, if they can go back to cleaner politics, good governance, that is one way to win people's heart. And that's also the reason why I echo Wen-Ti, that's the reason why the president was able to garner enough support to win the election.
Right. Wen-Ti, so once the political side of things is cleaned up, Dissanayaka's remit is definitely to pull the country out of its economic distress. How big a task is that?
Well, it's going to be quite a challenge for sure ahead for Sri Lanka and for its new president. I think, as you can tell, during the campaign, all major candidates pledged that they will continue to work with the IMF and work with the loan packages they've gotten from IMF, although, of course, the new president argued that he's going to try to seek room for review and renegotiate, hopefully on terms more favorable to Sri Lanka.
Which means lower taxes, is it?
It's going to be anyone's guess at this moment, but I think what they're going to look for is ways to perhaps defer repayment or to maybe get some more room, policy flexibility in terms of the austerity measures that IMF has been recommending Sri Lanka to pursue. Because with austerity means lower taxes, lower spending, lower welfare. And as you know, for an already struggling developing country like Sri Lanka, decreasing welfare at this moment could mean decreased support from the populace, especially those on the more working class side of society, which is also why I think this time around you get strong dissatisfaction from working class, who then vote in a working class oriented left or center candidate.
Yeah. Ronan, you wanted to jump in there?
Yeah, I want to jump in by offering some full information. Basically, now we are talking about a staggering external debt, right? So this is like they have to negotiate with the IMF on that front. And also, when you just mentioned the financial austerity that has to be imposed, and that's gonna make a lot of people's life difficult. But you have to do that, and then you also have to make sure that you don't get people too feeling too uneasy about the potential reform. So that's how to strike a fine balance between maintaining austerity and also fiscal discipline. I think is key to success.
Right. So on the debt levels, Wen-Ti, over the past 2 decades, China has obviously been investing heavily in Sri Lanka. We can talk about a few major projects. 2 in Hambantota, which is the home city of former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. 1 is a port, Hambantota Port, and 1 is an airport, Matala Rajapaksa International Airport. There's also Port City Colombo project, which is a massively ambitious project to essentially create a new city. That was started in 2014. Expected completion at the moment is 2041, and many, many more. Now, because Sri Lanka was unable to pay its debts it then had to lease the Hambantota port and also the surrounding land to China for 99 years. So what can we say about China's role in the debt default, in the crisis?
I mean, China definitely played a part in contributing to the already challenging debt situation for Sri Lanka, for sure. I think if I'm not mistaken, China accounts for somewhere around 1/5 of Sri Lanka's external debt. Mm-hmm. And so as to more broader issue, I think oftentimes when people talk about China-Sri Lanka relation, people talk about the possibility of a debt trap, for example, about how China may be trying to putting that Sri Lanka port Hambantota on a 99-year lease to China. That I've always had a little bit of a reservation about, because I can see how China is getting new access to a foreign port, but at the same time, we may be overestimating China's capacity for longer-term international caliber policy coordination of that scale as well when it comes to leveraging Belt and Road Initiative as a way to gain access to foreign territory, including port like that.
But it's in a prime location. It's a wonderful location, as we said, on those shipping routes in the Indian Ocean. Ronan, you mentioned about underperforming infrastructure. Yeah. Now, one of the airport that I mentioned in Hambantota, that's the Matala International Airport, is dubbed the world's emptiest airport. It's now been handed over to a joint venture between India and Russia. What's your view? We've heard Wen-Ti's view there that it's not very clear-cut as to whether China was being geostrategic in terms of this port. But all of this debt, surely that is significant leverage to have over a country. And then what happens next? It gives you then, control of that port for 90 years.
Yeah, so first I want to make it very clear that I think China approached Sri Lanka for geopolitical reasons. That's for sure. But I agree with Wen-Ti that China probably cannot take all the blame for the debt problems Sri Lanka is currently facing, because overall, basically, we're dealing with the problem of excessive borrowing from multiple sources. And then, so China actually, you can say that China made the problem worse, but China was probably not the root cause of the problem. Let me actually use an analogy to illustrate that point. Consider Sri Lanka as a person with very poor credit score. So usually, by and large, this person came to the bank requesting, a loan or things like that. Usually, their request will be denied, right? But China basically said, hey, here's the money, right? So you can spend, whatever project that you will be interested in. And because of the poor governance, so they made poor decisions, right? Spending money on projects that are not investment worthy. So that's the reason why, they could not pay it back, right? So that's the reason why, China was able to use that as a leverage. But we probably cannot say that all the problems were stemmed by the relationship with China. So on that front, on that point, I think I agree with Wen-Ti.
Okay. In January 2024, Sri Lanka imposed a one-year moratorium on the operation of any foreign research vessel in its exclusive economic zone. Global Times reported the ban prevented China's planned deep-water exploration in the southern Indian Ocean by the Shangyang 3 vessel that would have taken 5 months. China blames India and the US for demonizing Chinese ships as spy vessels. The Hindustan Times reported in 2023 at least 25 Chinese ships, including PLA warships, submarines, ballistic missile trackers and research vessels operated in the Indian Ocean, more than half of the total numbers since 2019. So we can see an increase there. Wen-Ti, why would India be so concerned about, for example, survey ships or ballistic missile trackers coming close to Sri Lanka?
I mean, China claims those vessels are for research purpose, and naturally, if you're in a region, you wonder research for what exactly, to what purpose, especially given that, given all the conversation about China going on about civil military fusion, how research could be for one purpose but end up having more than one usage, for example. So I think naturally, if you're a regional country, you have a certain level of discomfort with witnessing a rapidly militarily expansionistic power operating in your backyard. And it's in that sense that, I guess China will always argue that, hey, I'm not the only one running my ships around here in the open seas. For example, you will see, let's say, American, Australian, European, just recently German vessels operating in near Taiwan Strait, for example. And China would point to that and say, what about that?
Yeah, I think sort of the length of the time that they're staying in other countries' EEZs and, the number of instances of this. I believe there was some research that showed that China was the most extensive in terms of state surveys. Ronan, did you want to?
Yeah, so I would like to say that India in particular, they consider Sri Lanka as their natural sphere of influence. That kind of belief has been held for a very long time. And India is also very worried or concerned over China's growing influence in the region. So when you add these 2 points on top of each other, you realize that the reason why, among all the regional actors, India is particularly worried and concerned about China's influence.
So what do you think is the source of that concern, other than simply it doesn't like China to be in its neighborhood? What could China do to it?
Yeah, so number one, a lot of people are arguing that Sri Lanka is key for China's Build and New initiative success in the region. Right, so that's the reason why Sri Lanka plays an important role. That's number one. Number two, the use of strategically important ports that could basically add to some policy or even security implications in favor of China. And there's a country that basically engaging in strategic competition with China. It's very natural for India to be concerned about what China has been doing in the region. So even though that, according to Chinese narratives, is all for scientific exploration purposes, but you can say something, but whether to believe it or not, basically the assessment is on the Indian front.
Wen-Ti?
Yeah, I mean, just to add on Roland's point there, I'd really agree. There could be particularly implication for China's greater access to Sri Lanka. I mean, think about all the conversation about the Indo-Pacific strategy, for example, where India is trying to, or rather US, Japan, Australia, and India together are trying to find synergy between their security presence as a way to maintain regional peace and stability in both the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. It's in that sense that Sri Lanka, should China get greater access to Sri Lanka, given its strategic location, that could create a bottleneck in terms of India's ability to provide more linkage with its other friends and allies in the more Pacific basin side of things. So that's why I think China will have good geostrategic interest to pursue it, and also what India will be concerned about whether greater China presence there could mean a more isolated India, especially looking east towards the Pacific.
So you're saying in terms of perhaps thwarting or undermining India's ability to help its allies, in what sort of scenario? Are we talking in a wartime scenario?
Any number of things, really. Wartime scenario, obviously a worst case scenario, but even in terms of ability to chain gang together to form a collective deterrence front to deter China from pursuing greater gray zone security maneuvers, both in South China Sea and potentially in the more eastern part of the Indian Ocean, for example. All these matter certainly to Southeast Asia, but also to other friends and partners of Southeast Asia and beyond the region.
Ronan, CIA Director William Burns blamed Sri Lanka's economic collapse on the government's, what he called, foolish bets on Chinese investments. How would you describe the relationship between the former Rajapaksa presidency and Beijing? Premiership and Beijing?
Yeah, very close. Yeah. So you can see very personal and business ties between the former president and also, in China. And this is not just, government to government, it's, person to person. And the reason why, the CIA director made such a, you can say, harsh comment, but I think he's onto something that is very real. And I would actually, so in the eyes of Washington, they basically see, Chinese investment in Sri Lanka as part of the broader, strategy to extend its influence, right? And if, the byproduct of that is you can actually make Sri Lankan economy grow, then perhaps we can give you a pass. But that is not the case. So on the one hand, you're trying to explain your geopolitical influence in the region. On the other hand, in a lot of people's eyes, you are sabotaging the country's economy. So that's the reason why the site director basically will argue that you guys basically made a bet and now you became a loser. Yeah. And I think he's absolutely right.
So from the perspective of the US, why does it worry so much about China being in the Indian Ocean?
Okay, so I think two reasons. Number one, like I said, international important route, number one. Number two, they're afraid that China could use Sri Lanka as an example to say, hey, if you draw closer to me, you can get, for example, free money. Obviously, turns out not to be the case, but they can use Sri Lanka as a case to drive the wedge. And that's the reason why that will make Washington worry.
So the story of Sri Lanka surely then doesn't look very good for that relationship with that closeness to China because of the collapse.
Yeah,
so
but we have to be extremely cautious. The reason for that is because country is governed by people, and people can build special ties with Beijing. People can do, can employ policies that are harmful to the country but are beneficial to themselves and their family.
Wen-Ti, in 2023, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation announced $500 million. This was to support the development of a port in Colombo, a deep water container terminal. How strategic do you think this move was by the United States?
certainly makes sense from a U.S. perspective to put their money where their mouth is. I mean, I can just imagine if I were Sri Lanka, in past years, I will be asking for IMF bailout, and IMF, of course, has their own priorities in terms of austerity. So then China would say IMF financing is not without its costs in terms of Sri Lanka's domestic politics, and that's why then they will have to do they will have to look for Chinese financing as a different alternative option, one that perhaps had less policy relevant strings attached. So then when Western countries want to judge Sri Lanka, hey, Chinese aid may come with a certain debt trap attached, Sri Lanka will be like, then what do you want me to do? In which case, U.S. will have to step out and say, here we go. China is not the only meaningful alternative for you. How about try this and see if we can make it work together? So I think for U.S. perspective, it definitely makes sense. Obviously, for a more geostrategic level, one could almost argue that if we think of Taiwan as part of a first island chain as far as China's military security strategy is concerned, maybe Sri Lanka is somewhat of a first island chain for India's purpose, in which case that explains why China will have good military security reasons to want to use economic policies to gain a greater footing in Sri Lankan politics.
I want to talk about the implication for Sri Lanka.
Right,
basically,
the geopolitical tug of war.
So now you basically see, rival donors, right? So offering something to as an assistance. So basically, that can be considered as economic, lifelines with political strength, right? So like, I agree with Wen-Ti. I think obviously China will act something in return, but it's by the same token. The Western world or the U.S. will also act something in return. So from the Sri Lankan perspective, they really have to navigate the complex, landscape, because now they are entering the deep water of great power rivalry.
So, Wen-Ti, talking about that competing for influence, CCP mouthpiece, the Global Times, reported that Dissanyake's victory will likely further boost relations between China and Sri Lanka, and that his party shares many ideological similarities with China, and that they are likely to reduce ties with India and seek closer alignment with China's development strategies. How true do you think that those statements are?
I mean, it's Global Time doing what mouthpieces do, right? Trying to be optimistic about the future of bilateral relations. So it's natural and expected. Obviously, it's not completely without foundation. Obviously, the new president of Sri Lanka used to have a left-of-center political orientation in his past lives, including his party's political past. But it's one thing when you were in opposition. Oftentimes, when you're in opposition, when you're kept out of the political system, one natural impulse then is to light up fire here and there to see if you can create power vacuums to create political opening for your own political forces. Once you are in power, however, the game is very different. Once you're in power, you don't want to be lighting up fire here and there. And so while there may be some early life ideological kinship between the new Sri Lankan government, ruling party, and China, I don't see how that's going to overpower the much more rational, colder strategic calculus that Ronan talked about earlier. For example, that Sri Lanka needs to play one power against another in an attempt to get a greater concession and hopefully develop the aid that Sri Lanka needs to get out of these economic challenges.
Yeah, because Ronan, how essential does that make Chinese investment versus American investment versus Indian investment, given that, Dissanayake has promised cleaner politics. He's promised, that sort of cold, hard pragmatism in order to in order to rescue his country.
Yeah, so I think the new administration will likely approach for the Chinese investment extremely cautiously, considering the possible domestic backlash that could possibly arise. But we cannot, discount the role that China potentially plays in Sri Lanka's economic future. The reason for that is because, despite the fact that we mentioned China, India, and the U.S., but actually the menu of options for Sri Lanka is actually quite limited. And so China basically tried very, very hard to become very attractive for Sri Lanka. We don't know, the U.S. and India, they will put, the amount of effort into pursuing Sri Lanka. So on that front, I still believe that China's still gonna play a very important role in the coming couple of years.
Dissanayake's JVP party, which he's led for 10 years, has traditionally been opposed to India's interference in Sri Lanka's civil war and internal affairs. The JVP led an anti-India campaign in the late 1980s against the Indo-Lanka Accord, which it opposed as part of its political discourse against Indian expansionism. However, in February 2024, a delegation led by Dissanayake spent 3 days in India, including meeting with Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar. At the time, Dissanayake stated that India is Sri Lanka's closest neighbour and has become a major political and economic centre. Dissanayake said when making economic and political decisions, his coalition would care about how it will impact India. Wen-Ti, let me come to you with the last question. How concerned do you think Delhi will be about the new Sri Lankan president?
I think Delhi will know that a man can change and that the new Sri Lankan president, now that in power, will be pursuing national interests a lot more than anti-establishment party that he might have been known for early in life. Obviously, India will be cautiously watching development in Sri Lanka, of course, but suffice to say that while China has size, India has geography on its side, and certainly a good friend of India, well, increasingly better friend these days, US, has good strategic incentive to be invested in Sri Lanka's future as well.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much, Wen-Ti Sung and Ronan Fu, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.